Hello and welcome. You're watching Head to Head on uatv, and I'm Oles Kurdyuk. Changing Ukraine's defense sector is a key priority for implementing NATO standards in Ukrainian military forces, and recently President Petro Poroshenko submitted an urgent bill on the national security of Ukraine to the Ukrainian parliament. To help us understand this draft law and, in general, what changes to the defense sector are needed, we welcome to the studio Maksym Bugriy. He was a member of the International Advisory Group, which used to work on the bill, and he is Policy and Research Director at Wooden Horse Strategies Consulting Company. Hello, and thank you for being with us today, Mr. Bugriy.
Hello, Les. Thanks for having me.
So the first question is, what is so innovative about this new bill on national security?
This bill is on the agenda and should have been on the agenda not this year, but maybe several years ago already. The reform of the security sector is one of the priority reforms, and the legislation lags behind. It ought to match to the requirements of the new military that Ukraine has to have today.
You mentioned that the current legislation is lagging behind. What do you mean by that?
As an example, there is a law, the existing law on civilian democratic control over the military organization of the state. The term itself, military organization of the state, dates back to the times of Lenin. Virtually, we have a lot of rudiments of Soviet and Russian legislative tradition and thought, and at certain time the situation with these drawbacks does not let the sector to grow and does not let the sector to function properly.
So how does this new bill let the defense sector grow?
We should here consider not the defense sector per se, but the security sector in general. And this bill, the way that it was drafted and in the version that was submitted, although these versions are different, the one that was submitted by the president has certain differences with what the experts working group was working at. But one of the innovative concepts is that this bill considers the security sector, and the security sector, which is based on the security of the individual, of the society, and of the state, has the individual at the forefront. It is about the Ukrainian citizens that the security should be provided by the state primarily.
And also, as far as I know, there are some changes that in the legislation that adopt cooperation with NATO instead of Russia, that NATO is a strategic partner of Ukraine, and that the civilian would be appointed as the defense minister since the 1st of January in 2019. Right?
Yes. In fact, one of the novelties of the new bill on the national security is that it addresses the institution of the Ministry of Defense. Surprisingly, it was a surprise for me when I became involved as an analyst in working on this bill, and it may be also a surprise for our audience that we do not have a law on the Ministry of Defense. There is a provision in the Constitution, but there is no separate law, and to a certain extent the Ministry of Defense was not regulated by the law until this bill. We have a strategic defense...
So it is not legitimate in Ukraine, basically, the Ministry of Defense?
We won't say that. It is a constitutional body, of course, but then what goes after that was in different laws.
Blank space.
And there was no coherent provision. The idea of this bill was, if you recall the United States National Security Act of 1947, the idea was not exactly to define everything within the security and defense sector or detail every provision that the employees of this sector and the citizens should abide to, but to bring in some novelties to do what has not been done. In the United States, in 1947, the National Security Act created the whole set of new institutions, and here one of the provisions was to legally stipulate that the Minister of Defense should be civilian. Nevertheless, the Parliament, there are certain groups in the Parliament and certain experts that still call for attention to this bill, as some of its provisions give too much authority to the President in regulating the security sector, and perhaps we will have several amendments in the process of discussing and further passage of this law.
So there is going to be a controversy about this aspect that civilian would be appointed to be the Minister of Defense, right?
I worked at Razumkov Center quite recently, and we had some opinion polls. And there is a discrepancy that when there was a poll of the Ukrainian citizen, unfortunately, the majority of the Ukrainian citizens, and it is a matter of education, they perceive the Minister of Defense as a military person, not as a civilian person. But that was in 2015, 2016, while the majority of experts, they support the minister to be civilian. Why the minister should be civilian? Because it is not Marshal Ustinov that was the Minister of Defense of the Soviet Union, but it is primarily a state person, a state politician, responsible for the policy, for defense policy, and responsible for civilian democratic governance and control on behalf of the government and the President of the military. This person will not interfere in military decisions made by the Commander-in-Chief. He has no competence for this. He may not necessarily be a general, and in fact we have in Europe ministers that are quite beyond this sector, are not the military, but this is a policy person, and the civilian minister and the civilian ministry ministry employees should implement the policy of the Ukrainian citizens and their expectations from the defense area.
Well, there is some critics according towards this, and I want to quote right now military expert Dmytro Snegirov. He says that this kind of scheme, when the civilian would be appointed as the Minister of Defense, can be successful only in Western countries because of high level of democracy there. But in corrupted Ukraine, this post would be just a decoration, and the civilian minister would most likely follow the interest of oligarchs. How could you comment on that?
Well, this is quite a political statement by known expert Dmytro Snegirov, and I would say it depends. Ukraine is not a state that is lagging. Ukrainian people are not less smarter than Europeans and are capable, which was proven during Maidan and during the initial phases of the anti-terrorist operation. They know how to take matters in their own hands, and a civilian person is not necessarily the person not capable of leading, if there is a proper leader and a responsible politician. So much for that.
But then, in this kind of scheme, would the Ministry of Defense stay as a military control body or not?
Well, the Ministry of Defense...
Or only the general stuff?
The Ministry of Defense absolutely is a policy body that develops, first of all, the strategic level of the defense policy. The novelty of this law is the introduction of the defense strategy that Ukraine did not have until recently. It had the military doctrine and still has the military doctrine, which presently looks pretty much like a Western defense strategy, but still the name dates back to the Soviet Union and to the Russian Federation. But on the strategic level and on the policy level, such as procurement, such as the strategy and personnel management, of course, the civilian minister and civilian deputy ministers, which is also a novelty of this law, they do have the authority and they do have the responsibility. But nobody will question, of course, the decisions of General Muzhenko or any other high-level general that would demand this much forces at this direction or even in the strategic aspect of military capacities. In fact, this law introduces the defense planning and elaborates this defense planning concept to the standards that are in the US and in the NATO countries.
But will the Minister of Defense be subordinate to the President, who is Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, and at the same time to the Cabinet of Ministers and the Prime Minister, or how is this going to function?
This is this is $1 million question, and thank you for that. And this is one area where there is a lot of debate and there is certain criticism, but this area, this issue cannot be resolved by this law. Presently, there is a certain overlap of functions. The President is the Commander-in-Chief and has authority over the Ministry of Defense. At the same time, the Cabinet of Ministers also has functions in the defense policy area. And, for example, the Cabinet of Ministers, one of its primary responsibility is the defense industrial complex and the funding of the defense sector. But we do need to think about the constitution and probably at some point about a better balance between the President and the Cabinet of Ministers. But this is not the matter that can be regulated by this law. Unfortunately, to a certain extent, this law is a compromise, but as they say, strike the iron while it's hot. And perhaps we need, with certain amendments, to move on, and that would lead us to the next level of reform.
And you mentioned that in this draft law, Ukraine develops its strategy on national security. Could you tell us a bit more about this strategy?
The strategy has already been passed. It is a law. It was passed in 2015, and this strategy, this is exactly the strategy, as you rightly put it in, that Ukraine orients itself towards NATO. It has the goal of NATO membership and of the compatibility with the NATO standards, and by NATO standards I mean not the written standards, but as one of the defense experts said, the primary standard is the value of the soldier, that the soldier has one of the highest value in the military, unlike Marshal Zhukov's statement that women could produce more soldiers and we don't care. So this is the essence of the NATO standards and of the modern military that is and hopefully will be implemented in this new national security law.
What's your forecast on this bill?
Well, it's going to be tough. There are certain opinions of the political forces. There is a certain debate. Well, first of all, let's look at the big picture. The big picture is that our political forces, every political party has quite low support level. And in essence, this bill could be politicized to the extent that, let's say, some left-leaning or pro-Russia factions, like, for example, Yulia Tymoshenko bloc or the opposition bloc, they would somehow try to attack this bill from one hand. On the other hand, this bill does have certain imbalances in favor of the president, and there are experts that already cry out that the president has too much control. However, there is also a certain pressure from General Mattis, former General Mattis, and from NATO and in the US, because they would like the reform to be in earnest. It is a condition of the military aid, and we will not get javelins if we do not move forward with the reforms. So it's gonna be tough. However, it also seems on Friday there was an interparliamentary deputies group on the security and development, and this group includes, I think, now 20 members, and it was created by members of various factions in the Rada, who are to advance the security and defense reform. President recently told us that this year is going to be the year of the security and defense sector reform, and I would be still cautiously optimistic that even despite this law will be debated well, quite laboriously, but this is good, because during drafting this law there was well, maybe 1-2 parliamentarians, and we had to hunt for these people. Some of them were not really interested, but this time when the deputies will see their interests at stake, then they would be more concerned about the security of this country, which is the primary objective.
Right. So let's hope that Ukraine will succeed in developing its national security to go along with the NATO standards. And thank you so much for this interesting conversation.
No doubt about that. Thanks for having me, Oles.
That was Maksym Bugriy, expert in international economics and security. Thank you for watching Hat to Hat, and stay with UATV.